that wrong? No, I was only saying.
I'm Miles, and you're listening to Midnight Broadcast. Close your eyes. We're traveling by Storylight. This is the Storylight Chronicle, the lost voice of Radio Hour 17. There are stories you can hear, and stories that remember being heard. Tonight, we trace a frequency lost to time, a broadcast that slipped past the edge of memory and left its voice behind. The year was 1947. The place, KTRH, a modest AM radio station tucked between cotton fields and oil pumps on the outskirts of Houston. It was the kind of station where the walls hummed with a low, electrical prayer, and the floors smelled faintly of coffee and ozone. Everyone there wore too many hats, engineers doubling as announcers, receptionists scribbling scripts. There was no glamour, just the honest dust of regional radio, flickering across the South in a series of blips, pauses, and polite Southern drawls. But every Sunday night at 11, something changed. The lights dimmed. The engineers fell silent. And across the airwaves came a voice that didn't belong to the world of cattle reports and local church bulletins. It was something else entirely. It was Radio Hour 17. The show had no sponsors, no credits, no ads. Just a low chime, a string section from a dusty 78, and a voice, velvet, unhurried, gently strange, telling stories that curled through the wires like incense. The tales weren't quite horror, not quite fantasy. They were dreams with the logic pulled out. Stories that didn't end. They evaporated. Half the audience didn't understand them. The other half couldn't sleep without them. The voice belonged to someone listed only as E.V. Harrow in the station's sparse records. No first name, no photos. Just those initials, always typed, never spoken. For 5 years, Harrow broadcasted into the dark, week after week, a ghost behind a microphone. And then, in July 1952, it stopped. Without warning. No final episode. No goodbye. The tapes were gone. The booth was locked. The engineers shrugged. No one knew, or claimed to know, why the voice had vanished. But someone kept listening. Years passed. The building changed hands. KTRH was absorbed by a larger network, its towers rebuilt, its tapes boxed and forgotten. The city crept closer. Concrete smothered cotton. But on the edge of a much later decade, in 1993, a graduate student named Leah Fletcher came across a reference to Radio Hour 17 in a footnote of an old broadcast anthology. A single line. Local folklore regarding E.V. Harrow remains undocumented. CKTRH Archives, Box 41. Leah was working on a thesis about American radio storytelling, the transition from fireside dramas to commercialized formats. She'd never heard of Harrow, but that footnote nagged at her, like a half-remembered tune. She called the station. No one knew what she was talking about. But they gave her an address, a storage facility on the north side of town, full of legacy materials. It took 2 bus transfers and a mile walk to get there. The man at the desk didn't ask for ID. He just handed her a clipboard and pointed toward a metal door. Inside, rows of shelves, boxes, labeled with numbers in faded Sharpie. And in the back, on the lowest shelf, she found box 41. It was smaller than she expected. Inside were reel tapes, a few carbon copies of scripts, and a leather-bound notebook with no name. Just the embossed letters EVH on the front. She sat on the cold concrete floor and began to read. The first entry: if stories are seeds, the microphone is their soil. Every night I bury something. I don't know what will grow. Leah didn't know it yet, but she had just found the last record of a broadcast no one remembered, from a voice that refused to be forgotten. That night, Leah borrowed an old, reel-to-reel player from her advisor and threaded one of the tapes. It hissed to life with a warble, then the soft click of a mic being turned on. There was a pause, then the voice. Good evening, travelers of static and signal. This is Radio Hour 17. The hour that forgets the clock, the voice that waits between worlds. Tonight's story begins with a door, not one you can open, one you've already walked through. Leah felt a chill climb up her neck. The voice was like anything she'd ever heard. Male, maybe, or female, or neither. Measured, kind, ancient. It was like being read to by someone who had waited a very long time to be heard. The story itself was strange. A man finding letters from his future self in the lining of an overcoat. Each one dated for a day he hadn't lived yet. And with each letter, a decision, a divergence, a new life. When the recording ended, she realized she hadn't moved in nearly 30 minutes. She spent the next 6 months transcribing, digitizing, researching. But the deeper she went, the stranger it all became. There were no personnel files, no tax records. The scripts referenced events that hadn't happened yet. One tape ended with a phone number that hadn't existed in 1951, but had become an emergency line in the late 1980s. And then there were the listeners. She found letters, dozens of them, some dated decades apart, all addressed to E.V. Harrow. All said the same thing. Thank you for speaking when I needed to be heard. Some were from people who claimed the broadcast had saved them. Others said it had warned them. A few said it had spoken directly to them, told stories that described their lives before they lived them. One woman wrote, I heard you describe the death of my husband 2 years before he passed. I didn't believe it. Then I did. Then I loved him harder. You gave me time I didn't know I had. None of these people were ever found in full. The return addresses no longer existed. The names were half faded. But Leah began to believe them. Because one night, as she sat surrounded by tape spools, she heard her own name in a recording she hadn't yet played. Leah, the voice said, don't be afraid of what finds you. She dropped the headphones, and in that moment, she understood something she hadn't let herself consider. The voice on the tape wasn't just a broadcaster. It was a memory, still alive, still unfolding, and it was watching her now. Leah didn't sleep that night, not deeply. The voice echoed behind her thoughts like a lullaby caught in a loop, faint and half-broken, but persistent. Leah, don't be afraid of what finds you. She kept telling herself there must be a rational explanation, a name coincidence, an editing artifact, maybe even some prank. But she was alone in the archives. No one else had keys. No one else even believed her. By morning, she had listened to every one of the tapes in box 41. 23 in total. Most were full broadcasts. A few were fragments, spliced mid-sentence, warped by time or neglect. One had no audio at all but still played a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat slowed to the tempo of memory. The stories varied, fables, monologues, eerie vignettes, but all carried the same quiet cadence, the same uncanny intuition for describing what people never admitted out loud. Grief, estrangement, yearning. Some episodes veered toward the surreal. A diner where patrons ordered memories instead of meals. A town whose clocks ticked backward for a single hour each year. A woman who kept finding old photographs of herself in places she'd never been. But none of the stories were frightening in the traditional sense. They weren't meant to scare. They were meant to listen back. She started keeping notes, not just about the content, but the feeling. Every time she heard the voice, she felt seen, not watched, not surveilled, but recognized as though a part of her, the lonelier, hungrier part, was quietly responding in kind, as though something beneath the surface of her life had been waiting to be named, and now that it had been, it wouldn't return to silence. Her academic notes began to blur into something else. The margins of her transcripts filled with questions. Was this a real broadcast, or something outside of time? How did they know my name? Who else heard them? And why? But most unsettling was the realization that these were not just passive recordings. They responded. Not in the way a voicemail echoes your voice, but in the way a memory adapts over time. On her third playback of tape 11, a line changed. At least she thought it did. The narrator described a library where each book was blank until opened. She remembered the sentence ending, "We read ourselves into being." But now, it said, she read herself into the echo she feared. And found herself already written. She didn't want to tell anyone. Not yet. Not until she understood. And then she found the notebook. It had slipped between the real boxes and the bottom of the carton. Black leather, embossed in the same initials, E.V.H. But this wasn't the same as the earlier notebook. This one was older, more worn, with entries written in a finer, more hurried hand. The pages were crowded with symbols, underlines, odd diagrams, one of which resembled a radio tower drawn with concentric waves branching outward, overlaid with the phrase, "Broadcast memory equals echoed intention." Another page bore a list of names, places, years. A pattern emerged. Every name had a corresponding date and signal strength, like Lenore M., Kingsport, 1949, 7:60 a.m., 5 kilowatts. There were dozens of them. Leah's own town, own date, was there too. Leah F., Houston, 1993, 9:90 a.m., 10 kilowatts. She dropped the notebook. Then she laughed nervously, like someone catching their reflection moving just a second out of sync. A coincidence. Or maybe not. She scanned the rest of the entries. Several seemed to be transcripts of unwritten episodes. Shows that hadn't appeared in the tapes she had. One story, titled "The Girl in Frequency B," described a character who could only communicate through static, slipping in and out of conversations by modulating her voice through electric hums. Another, called Chamber of Dials, featured a map of radio stations that no longer existed but aligned with ancient astronomical charts. And then, on the final page of the notebook, a phrase written and rewritten in different inks, crossed out and repeated until it blurred. "The Storylight remembers you." Leah didn't know what Storylight meant. It didn't appear in any of the tapes, not directly. But something about it rang familiar. It felt less like a term and more like a place, an experience, a memory too large to fit into a single sentence. She stayed in the archives for days. The attendant stopped asking questions. She brought her own food, her own bedding. Every night she listened to the tapes in the same order, waiting for the change to happen again. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it did. A new word, a new pause. Once, she heard the voice hummed her mother's lullaby, a tune she hadn't heard since she was 6. That was when she began to cry. Not because she was scared, because she felt found. The deeper she went, the more she began to realize that Radio Hour 17 hadn't just vanished. It had slipped. Slipped between formats, between belief systems, between years. Like a needle that continued to turn even after the record stopped spinning. She contacted a few other audio historians, discreetly, cautiously. Most thought she was indulging in urban folklore. One, a retired signal technician named Miles Kerr, was different. He didn't dismiss her. He asked only one question. Did you hear the door close? Leah didn't understand. What door? You'll know, he said. When it happens, everything changes. The voice begins to speak through you. She ended the call shaken. A part of her wanted to dismiss him, but another part, the same part that had sat frozen in place listening to those first tapes, believed him. Then, one afternoon, something did change. She was splicing a broken reel for playback when the station's main electricity flickered. Not unusual in the old building, but this time, the flicker lingered. The overhead lights dimmed, then flared. A low hum filled the air, and on the reel-to-reel deck, a red light began blinking. Though she hadn't powered it on, the machine began to spin. She froze. No tape had been loaded. Still, it played. And then the voice returned, not through speakers, but through the room itself. The walls buzzed with it. The floor vibrated. Leah, it said, clearer than ever before. You've come to the hour. But it isn't 17. It's now. And now is the only place stories survive. She wanted to run, but instead, she did the only thing that made sense. She listened. The air thickened. Time didn't stop. It folded. She saw herself in echoes, sitting in the library as a child, recording her own voice into a cassette player, mimicking the radio announcers she'd adored. She saw herself alone in college dorms, her headphones wrapped around her like a shield. She saw the moments when sound had saved her, not through meaning, but through presence. Then the voice continued. This is Storylight. This is the memory that remembers you. This is the station without time. And you, Leah Fletcher, are now part of the broadcast. She couldn't breathe. And yet, she wasn't afraid. She picked up a microphone, one she hadn't noticed before. It was old, brass-rimmed, and warm to the touch. No cords, no power, and still, it hummed with potential. She raised it to her lips and whispered, "Are you listening?" Silence. Then, a gentle chime. The broadcast had begun, and for the first time, Leah wasn't just the listener. She was the voice. The days that followed blurred. Leah no longer marked time by clocks or windows. Her measure became the rhythm of the broadcasts. Not just the ones from the tapes, but those now coming from her. Each night she returned to the microphone. Each night she spoke, without script, without outline, just memory, feeling, resonance. And each night, something answered. It started subtly. A tap. A pause between her words filled by something else. At first, it felt like feedback, but it had shape, tone, intent. Then came the words. Not loud, quiet enough to doubt. A second voice, overlapping hers in the hush between syllables. Not speaking to her, but with her. Like someone reading in harmony from a page she hadn't yet turned. She began to document these sessions. Not on paper, on cassette. She had boxes now. New boxes marked Storylight sessions. But unlike Box 41, these reels didn't deteriorate or fall silent. They pulsed. You could feel it if you touched the tape, the faint thrum of a signal still being written. She knew now that this wasn't just a mystery. It was an invitation. Something, or someone, was waiting to be finished, and it could only do so by being heard. One night, she played back a tape of herself speaking about an old memory. A car ride with her father years ago, just before he left for good. They had listened to AM radio, some low-budget storytelling show with a scratchy male voice reading what sounded like ghost stories. She hadn't thought about that moment in decades. On the tape, her voice trembled as she described the sound of the dashboard humming, the way her father had looked. Not angry, just absent. Half there. But it wasn't until the tape neared the end that she noticed something new. Her voice faded out. And another took over. "Leah," it said. "You remember the static. That's how it begins. But what you forget is that he was listening too. He never changed the station. He let you hear the whole thing. That was his way of saying goodbye." She stopped the tape. Her fingers shook. That hadn't been her voice. It hadn't been on the original recording. But it knew. She found herself talking aloud in the empty room, not as a test, not to provoke, but because she expected to be heard now. She had the sense that there was a memory behind the memory, one she couldn't reach without broadcasting into it. That the act of speaking was the act of finding. She called it the loop, and it worked both ways. One night, while replaying a reel from Box 41, the one labeled "In Absence, a Light," she heard something new. Not a voice this time. A sound. A street corner. She could hear footsteps, distant and crisp. Then a bell. A very specific bell. The kind on older shop doors. She recognized it. It was from her childhood. A bookstore her mother used to take her to on Sundays. There was no way that sound should have been on a broadcast from 1955. And yet there it was. Clear as day. The next day, she visited the bookstore, still standing, though now a stationary shop. She walked through the door, and the same bell chimed. Identical. She turned, expecting, she didn't know what. A sign. A person. Instead, on the far shelf, she saw a stack of cassettes. Old. Unlabeled. One had a single handwritten note inside the case. Hour 17. You are here. She bought it without a word. Back at the archive, she played the cassette. It didn't start with music or tone. Just breathe. And then, a woman's voice. Older. Familiar. Not her own. But not unknown. Leah, you've come further than I ever did. You've stayed longer in the light. I was only a visitor. You're the archivist. The keeper. Leah leaned in. Don't be afraid of the end. It's not silence. It's the beginning of the echo. The tape ended. She rewound it. Played it again. The message was gone. Just static. It was clear to her now. She was part of the same phenomenon she had spent her life trying to catalog. She wasn't just studying lost radio, she's mine in Maine. Was. Continuation of it. The signals hadn't vanished. They had simply moved into memory, into story, into people willing to listen hard enough to hear what most dismissed as noise. She began to map her findings, not on paper, but sound. Using a spectrum analyzer, she captured the frequencies of each reel, charted the subtle shifts in tone, pace, ambient distortion. What emerged wasn't just a pattern, it was a voice print, but not of a person, of a place. A conceptual geography that revealed itself only in modulation. Storylight was not a station. It was aware. a lattice of signal interwoven with memory and emotion, navigable only through deep listening. She began to theorize that certain minds, or maybe hearts, could tune into this place more easily. Not through intellect, but through longing. The more she tuned in, the more the broadcasts changed. She stopped recognizing her own voice. One episode, she recalled a childhood friend who had vanished without goodbye. A girl named Evie who once claimed she could hear other people's dreams if she pressed her ear to their mouths as they slept. Leah hadn't thought of her in years, and yet, mid-broadcast, she said aloud, "Evie, I never said I was sorry." The voice on the tape replied, "I heard you then. I hear you now." She wept. Not because it was true, but because part of her had always believed it might be. It became harder to return to the real world. The sun felt too bright. Conversations felt too thin. Every moment away from the archive felt like stepping outside a story she was no longer a reader of, but a character within. She began to write letters she never sent. To voices, to ghosts, to people she hadn't met yet. She left one under the microphone. "If you find this place, remember, you're not alone. You're never alone. Listen deeply. The signal is waiting." She started sleeping in the archive. The dreams changed, not nightmares, more like broadcasts of their own. Rooms filled with radios, each one tuned to a different whisper. Windows that looked out not into the street, but into past moments, her 5th birthday, her first breakup, her grandfather's last words, and always, always, that hum beneath it all. Not threatening, comforting, like a blanket of airwaves wrapped around the soul. She knew now what the original host must have discovered. That Radio Hour 17 wasn't canceled. It transcended. It became a place you go, not a program you hear. And that some people, the listeners who stayed long enough, became hosts themselves. Weeks passed, or maybe more. The calendar meant little now. One evening, a young intern named Clara found Leah asleep in the booth, surrounded by tapes and notes. She gently shook her awake. "Professor Fletcher, it's late. Are you okay?" Leah blinked, eyes adjusting to the fluorescent glare. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was just listening." Clara looked around. "There's no power. The machines are off." Leah tilted her head. "No," she said. "They're on. You just don't hear it yet." She gave Clara a copy of one reel, the one labeled Memory in Mono. Told her to play it in a quiet room. Alone. Clara did. She never said what she heard. But the next day, she returned with a question. "Have you ever spoken to someone who already knew your dreams?" Leah just smiled. "Welcome to Storylight," she said. "You're tuned in now." Clara became her first real companion in the archive. Not just a colleague, but a believer. Where others had grown wary of Leah's increasingly reclusive behavior, Clara leaned in, drawn to the quiet gravity of the place. She was young, but carried an old kind of awareness. The type that made you feel as though she was listening to more than just your words. She began reviewing tapes independently. Leah gave her access to the secondary reels, the ones that hadn't spoken to her as clearly. And slowly, Clara started finding her own patterns. Small distortions, recurring phrases, sonic motifs that echoed across decades. She didn't call them voices. She called them threads, and she believed they were weaving something. One day, Clara brought Leah a notebook, hand-bound, filled with careful annotations, sketches, timelines. But what struck Leah most was a series of frequency maps. Clara had overlaid the audio spectrums from multiple storylight broadcasts across years, even decades. When stacked, they formed a pattern, a spiral. Not perfectly symmetrical, more like a helix, organic, living. "I think it's growing," Clara said. Leah stared at the spiral. "What is?" "The signal," she said. "Or maybe the memory of it. I don't think it's just a recording. I think it's becoming. Every time someone listens, it changes, like it knows." Leah nodded slowly. She had felt it too. That strange reciprocity, as though the act of listening nourished the signal. It reminded her of an old story, how certain seeds only germinate after being eaten by birds. Transmission through consumption. She asked Clara what she thought was at the center of the spiral. Clara didn't hesitate. "A question." "What kind?" "The kind that doesn't want an answer, just wants to be shared." Leah felt a chill. That night, the radio booth felt different. Not darker, deeper, like a cathedral without walls. She stepped inside and closed the door. The ONAIR sign flickered on, but she didn't touch it. It did so by itself. She leaned into the mic. "You're still listening," she said. "You always were. Even before I had the words. I think maybe you're older than the words. Maybe older than memory. But not older than feeling. That's where you live, isn't it?" No reply came. Just the warm buzz of silence. But she knew that buzz now. It wasn't absence. It was prelude. She spoke anyway. "I don't know your name. I don't know if you're a person, a signal, a remnant of an idea too old to be classified. But I know this. You were never just a broadcast. You were a place we carried inside us. And I think I'm ready to go further in." She turned the gain dial. Just a hair. The tone shifted. A hum emerged. Not a frequency, but a note. One that tugged at her bones. Her breath caught. "Okay," she whispered. "Show me." And the reel began to spin, on its own. The voice came faint at first. Male. Not the original host. Not Leah. Something older, like a phonograph played underwater. In the hour beyond the hour, where the night folds in on itself, there is a voice. Not yours. Not mine. But made of both. This is hour 17. We've been waiting. The tape continued. She recognized snatches of broadcasts she'd heard before. Lines from earlier episodes, recontextualized, rearranged. But there were new lines too. Things that hadn't been on any reel. Signal isn't just sound. It's choice. It's memory with intention. When you remember deeply enough, you transmit. That's the key. The voice faded. Then a new one emerged. Clara's. But if memory can transmit, can it receive? The response came not as speech, but music. A single sustained chord, minor, unresolved. And behind it, a voice humming. Wordless. Familiar. Her mother's voice. Leah's hand flew to her mouth. She hadn't heard the sound in 20 years. Not on tape. Not in dreams. But there it was. Humming the lullaby she hadn't remembered until that moment. She sobbed. Not in sadness. In recognition. The booth faded away. Or rather, it expanded. The walls dissolved. She was standing in a version of the archive that felt liminal. Dustless. Everything glowed faintly. Not with light, but with presence. The tapes on the shelves no longer had labels. They had faces. Names she hadn't heard in decades. Listeners who had written in, called in, disappeared. It was as if the archive had remembered them for her. She took one reel at random, slotted it into the deck, pressed play. It didn't play audio. It played time. She was back in 1989, her college dorm. rain tapping on the window, her roommate asleep. She was working on her first audio project, an interview with a local jazz player who'd once played backup on pirate AM stations. She remembered this moment, but now she was in it again, watching herself from just outside time. The tape she'd used then was the same she'd found later in the archive. She hadn't retrieved it. It had returned to her. Back in the booth, the reel clicked to a stop. She was herself again, but not unchanged. She understood something now. Storylight wasn't linear. It wasn't archived in order. It looped, layered, nested. It was like a dream you could record, but only if you were willing to forget you were dreaming. That's why so few heard it. That's why the host had vanished. He hadn't disappeared. He'd arrived. The next morning, she found a small box at her desk. No address. Just a sticker on top. A black spiral. Inside, one tape. She inserted it. The voice was unmistakable. His. The host. "Leah," he said. "You're not alone anymore. Storylight isn't mine. Never was. It was always waiting. For someone like you. Someone to go further than remembering. Someone to transmit." She wept. He continued. "I'm still here. Just in a different frequency. You'll find me. You're close." The tape ended. In the silence that followed, Leah spoke aloud, her voice soft, steady. "I'm still listening." Word spread. The archive gained visitors. Not tourists, seekers. People who had caught fragments of Storylight on old radios, in dreams, in memories they didn't know they still had. They came with stories, not proof. Just knowing. That was enough. Leah began hosting a new version of Radio Hour 17. Not for a network, for the Signal. She didn't broadcast on any traditional band, but every night, at precisely 1:17 a.m., the booth light turned on. The reel spun, and she spoke. Not to a crowd, to whoever was listening. And always someone was. Clara called them echoes. Voices that replied not in words, but in moments. Books falling open to the right page. Streetlights flickering in code. A song playing that hadn't existed before. They weren't hallucinations. They were affirmations. Signal replying to signal. Leah kept recording. Box after box, each labeled not with numbers, but with questions. Have you ever known something before it happened? Have you ever been dreamed by someone else? Do you remember something you never lived? She began to believe that questions themselves were transmissions, and asking them with intent allowed you to connect. Not just with the past, with what came next. She no longer feared the end of the tape. She understood now. There was no end, only signal. And Storylight was what came through when you let the story continue without needing to finish it. The phenomenon grew quietly, like ivy behind plaster. No headlines, no forums, just stories. Whispered, mailed, recorded on aged cassettes and shipped to P.O. boxes Leah hadn't realized were still active. People sent postcards with no return addresses. A trucker scrawled his memory of hearing Storylight at a rest stop radio in Nebraska. A woman enclosed an old mixtape with one side blank, and the other side playing only static until precisely the 47th second, when a voice whispered, the signal wasn't just returning, it was responding. Leah and Clara took notes on everything. Not to analyze, not in the traditional way. They weren't scientists now. They were custodians, keepers of resonance. The library became a different place at night. It breathed somehow. Shelves groaned like timbers on a ship. Light bulbs hummed in tones that didn't match the wiring. And always, the radio booth glowed faintly from behind its glass. Clara said it felt like standing beside a tide. And sometimes, Leah agreed. The stories came in waves, and if you stood still long enough, you began to feel the undertow. One night, Clara emerged from the booth with a reel she hadn't put in. "I didn't touch the drawer," she said. It was already playing. The tape was old, but not archival. Homemade. The label was a single word in pencil. Margaret. Clara pressed play. The voice was young. A girl, no older than 10. Reading a story. Haltingly. Nervously. Then, laughter. A man's voice. Kind. Patient. "You've got it. Try again, sweetheart." Leah's breath caught. She hadn't heard that name since childhood. The tape wasn't from the archive. It was from her grandfather's attic, from a day she barely remembered. She had recorded her first attempt at radio that afternoon, pretending to be a host while her grandfather operated the reel-to-reel machine he used for local shows in the 1960s. The reel had been lost in a fire, or so she thought. Clara stared. "You know this voice." Leah nodded. "It's me. And him." "But how?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Later that night, Clara sat across from her with a notebook full of timelines, frequencies, and a scribbled phrase circled in red ink. Temporal resonance memory bleed. It was a theory Clara had been sketching in silence. That memory, when recorded and replayed under certain conditions, could loop not only through minds, but through time. That storylight, if it was what they thought, a signal made of story, echo, and intent, could reach backward and forward, redistributing moments like a tide picks up driftwood. They weren't just listening to broadcasts, they were listening to returns. Leah remembered a phrase from the original host, one she'd dismissed as poetic metaphor at the time. Radio is the memory of time's breathing, and we're all exhaled eventually. Maybe he hadn't been metaphorical at all. They began to receive letters, physical ones, always. Never emails. People describing memories that weren't their own, but that carried the feeling of belonging. Dreams of cities that didn't exist on any map, but contained the same street names, cafes, and weather patterns. People met there, strangers, then lovers, and awoke remembering each other's full names. One man wrote that he had heard the Storylight broadcast on a transistor radio in 1974 in a small town in New Mexico. The problem, he explained, was that he was born in 1982. He remembered it before he was born. And somehow, the tape he enclosed, recorded on a battered reel, contained Leah's voice. Not now. Leah. A version of her that hadn't spoken the lines yet. They checked. Word for word, she would read them 10 nights later during an unscripted session in the booth. She never remembered saying them before they happened, but the signal had. Clara's theory expanded. This isn't just signal. It's sympathetic story wave, a kind of quantum echo chamber. Not digital, not analog, but resonant. They tried recording the broadcast in different conditions, with the booth door open, with it closed, with no one speaking at all. In one experiment, Clara simply placed an object, her grandmother's old music box, inside the booth, left the reel turning, and walked away. The recording, when played back, contained no music, but it contained a voice. Leah's, whispering, "I remember this." But she didn't. Not consciously. They traced the origin of the box. It had belonged to a woman who once appeared in the margins of a Storylight transcript in 1973. She'd written a fan letter to the host, describing a dream of a booth made of glass where voices sang through wires without speaking. The handwriting matched that of Clara's grandmother. Time wasn't just folding, it was spiraling inwards. They began referring to the phenomenon as the coil. One storm-heavy evening, a package arrived. It was wrapped in wax paper, tied with string. Inside, a single reel, again, unlabeled, and a brass key. The tape hissed to life in the booth. A voice began, neither male nor female. Soft, rhythmic, layered. This is the last archive, the one beneath the static. You've heard us before, in laughter, in footsteps, in the silence between songs. We are not the past. We are what holds the past in place. The voice faded, replaced by a field recording. Ocean waves. Then, a second voice, Leah's, reciting a list of names she had never spoken. Names she recognized only as handwriting from letters and postcards they'd received. Listeners, long gone. Then a pause. Then Clara's voice. They're not gone. The tape ended. The brass key matched nothing in the archive, but they kept it. Something told them it wasn't for a lock in the building. It was for a lock in the story. The next few days blurred. Visitors began showing up without understanding why. One woman said she'd been sleepwalking and woke on the library steps. A man in his 60s carried an envelope with a single phrase written in ink. You left this behind. Inside, a photo. Leah, age 17, standing in a place she'd never been, smiling beside the original host. It was impossible. Yet there it was. Clara began to suggest that maybe Storylight wasn't just archival at all. Maybe it was alive. A collective organism formed from memory, signal, intention, and longing. It's not just broadcasting anymore, she said. It's calling. And Leah was beginning to feel it too. That sense of being observed not by eyes, but by moments. Like a narrative was watching itself be told. She began ending each night's session with a question. Not for the listeners, for the signal itself. Where are you now? Why did you choose us? What is the story you don't want to end? Sometimes, the tape replied. Other times, it simply spun blank. But always, in the morning, something new appeared. A paper with strange marks. A poem in a language that half resembled Morse code. A whisper on playback that only one of them could hear. The signal wasn't passive. It was curating, choosing how and to whom it would respond. Leah's voice began to change too, not audibly, but in cadence. She'd catch herself saying phrases that felt inherited, old idioms no one used anymore. Her dreams blurred into broadcasts. She would dream a conversation with the host, wake up, and find her side of it recorded on the reel. Storylight was writing through her, and she no longer feared it. She trusted it. Then, one night, the booth did something it had never done before. It locked. From the inside. Clara was at the board, monitoring the reel. Leah had stepped into the booth to begin the session. The moment the door closed, a click echoed through the library. The recording light glowed amber, not red. Leah was visible, but muted behind the glass. She wasn't speaking. She was listening. The reel spun faster than it should, then slowed. Clara tried to open the door. It wouldn't budge. Inside, Leah mouthed something. Again and again. Clara wrote it down. 17 is not an hour. It's a gate. Then the power surged. The lights in the booth flickered. The sound on the board vanished. Then, silence. Utter, bone-deep silence. Then the lights returned. The door clicked open. Leah stepped out, calm. What happened? Clara asked. She smiled. I heard the end. Clara blinked. The end of the broadcast? No, Leah said. The end of the beginning. After that night, everything changed. The booth no longer needed tapes. Leah could sit down, speak, and the signal would manifest. captured perfectly without physical media. The reels still turned, yes, but the magnetic strip no longer held anything. The words were encoded elsewhere, in a place neither she nor Clara could name. It was as if the booth had become a mirror to a deeper frequency, one that responded only to presence, not process. They stopped calling it the booth, and began calling it the room. It had become less a machine and more a place, like a chapel that could listen. And the voice that came through it wasn't always Leah's. Sometimes the voice was male, old and crackling like a 1940s vinyl. Other times, it was a soft female whisper, layered beneath Leah's own, speaking in tandem, but never out of sync. Occasionally, the voice was plural, overlapping tones forming a chorus that recited poems neither of them had written, but both felt they'd once memorized. They stopped airing sessions to the public. This wasn't content anymore. It was communion. Clara compiled transcripts obsessively. The broadcast became increasingly recursive, referencing past episodes that never aired, describing future events that hadn't occurred yet, quoting letters from people who had yet to send them. One line stood out, repeated across multiple sessions. 17 is the hour where memory sleeps with the light on. It wasn't metaphor. Not anymore. Not after what they discovered in the sub-basement. The library's blueprints never mentioned a second basement. But on a snowy evening, Leah dropped her pen while descending the archive stairs. It rolled into a wall and stopped. When she reached for it, her fingers touched something cold. Not stone, but metal. A seam. Behind a bookshelf was a steel hatch flush with the concrete. No latch, no keypad. Just a faint engraving. R17. Room 17? Radio hour 17? Clara fetched the brass key from months ago. It fit. The hatch opened with a sigh, revealing stairs that descended into darkness too complete for natural absence. Leah and Clara stood at the threshold for several long minutes, feeling the tug. Then, together, they stepped inside. The staircase spiraled like a shell. Smooth, curved, impossibly long. It felt like descending into the center of a forgotten thought. At the bottom, a door. No handle, only a plaque. To enter is to remember. To remember is to listen. The door opened on its own. Inside, the walls were lined with radios. Dozens of them, each tuned to a different frequency. Some buzzed, others whispered. A few played full monologues, voices they'd heard in their dreams, reciting stories that looped like lullabies. In the center, a microphone on a pedestal. Old, dustless, perfect. Next to it, a small card. Say your name. Leah stepped forward. She hesitated, then whispered, Leah. The radios fell silent. A single voice replied through all of them at once. You have been heard. Clara followed. Clara. The same stillness. Then, you have been returned. The microphone pulsed with a soft blue light. It was not plugged into anything. Clara looked at Leah. What is this place? Leah's voice was quiet. I think it's the original broadcast room, but it's never been on any plan. No, she agreed, because it was never built. It was remembered. The walls shifted. Not physically. Perceptually. They could now see outlines of people, faint, like after-images on an old screen. Broadcasters in mid-sentence, listeners with headphones, a child holding a crystal radio set beneath a blanket. A soldier in a trench, listening to a voice from home. Memories, preserved in signal, replayed through space. Clara reached out and touched the wall. The scene rippled, then changed. A young woman in a recording booth. Her nameplate, Margaret Ellen Rains. Leah gasped. That's her. That's my grandmother. The room shifted again. An old man at a desk. The host. But not as he looked in the old photos. He was younger, alive, present. He looked up at Leah directly. You're early, he said. The vision faded. They exited the room in silence. When they reached the library's main floor, morning light had already arrived. They had been gone for hours, or maybe days. The booth was still glowing. Leah stepped inside. No script, no reel. Just a breath. Then she spoke. Broadcast number 17, the hour between memory and return. Clara recorded it. The first thing Leah said next was, to those who've waited. The story remembers. Then she told a story neither of them had ever heard. About a girl with no voice who found a signal buried beneath her dreams. About a booth that spoke before it was built. About a place where stories waited to be remembered. It was not a performance. It was a retrieval. From that point on, the broadcasts no longer needed explanation. They became returns. Rituals. Not always nightly. Sometimes not for weeks. But when Leah stepped into the booth, the story was there, waiting to come through. People began to gather outside the library. They didn't speak much. They just waited. When a broadcast aired, they would listen in silence, then disperse. Some returned with tapes. Others with drawings of places they'd never visited. One boy handed Clara a page from a comic book that didn't exist, drawn in ink, but with Leah's voice in the speech bubbles. Where did you get this? Clara asked. He shrugged. I found it in my backpack. I don't remember putting it there. Each artifact was different. Each one referenced Radio Hour 17, even if no one remembered hearing it. Clara finally admitted it aloud, one night while closing up. I think the host never disappeared. Leah turned. You think he's still alive? No, Clara said. I think he became the signal. They tried tracking the original broadcast, from 1968 again, the elusive Hour 17. But each archive copy was corrupted in a different way. One had reversed audio. Another played only in infrared. One consisted entirely of the sound of rain on metal. But when layered, something emerged. Not a voice. Not exactly. A pattern. It was a story in Morse code. They translated it over several sleepless nights. The message, I waited for the ones who'd hear me backwards. It was signed. M. They realized then that the host had been preparing for this. That Storylight wasn't a show. It was a vessel. A ship carrying meaning forward through listeners, through memory, through echo. The host had never left. He had simply folded into the coil. And now Leah and Clara were inside it too. They renamed the room. No longer the booth. Not even the room. They called it the gate, because each broadcast wasn't a message sent. It was a message returned. And they, now, were the receivers. Clara sat in the library's corner reading room, the one with the stained glass dome no one remembered building. It had always been there, supposedly. But neither she nor Leah could find a record of it in the building plans. The light that filtered through the glass was always that of a late afternoon, regardless of time. She held a copy of the transcript from the last broadcast, not a printout, a typescript, typed on a machine she didn't own, using paper she hadn't bought. The ribbon must have been old, the ink faint, the letters fading into their own outlines. Still, she could read it. The final line stood out. To return is to echo. But to echo is to open. Clara whispered it to herself. Open what? That night, Leah didn't record. Instead, she asked Clara to listen. Do you hear it? She said, standing in the booth. The gate. With her eyes closed. Not the hum. Not the tape. Beneath all that, Clara leaned in and heard breathing. Not Leah's. The booth was breathing. She stepped back. Is this new? Leah shook her head. It's been doing it for weeks. I just didn't want to say it out loud. The breath wasn't hostile. It was measured. Calm. Almost protective. The kind of breath a parent might make beside a sleeping child. Clara spoke into the air. What are you? Silence. Then the lights flickered, briefly. Just long enough for the bookshelves to cast long shadows on the stone floor. One shadow lingered, human-shaped. Clara turned. Nothing there. But the chill didn't leave. The next day, a woman appeared at the front desk. Her coat was damp from rain, though the sky outside was clear. She carried a cardboard box labeled Return. She set it down and said nothing. Clara approached. Can I help you? The woman only pointed to the box, then walked out. Inside were tapes, cassette, reel-to-reel, and even wire recordings, dozens of formats, each labeled only with numbers. No names, no content descriptions, just dates. The oldest 1942. The newest the next day's date. One reel bore the label, RH-17. Clara showed it to Leah. Do you think it's the original? No, Leah said gently. I think it's the next one. They didn't play it. Not yet. That night, Clara dreamt of a room filled with microphones, each suspended over a still pool of black water. Every time one of the mics spoke, the ripples moved backward. The voice was hers, but saying things she hadn't thought yet. Warnings, maybe. Promises. A song she didn't remember learning. She woke with a word on her lips. Reversal. She didn't tell Leah. Instead, she went to the library's oldest section, the annex. The shelves there predated the library's foundation, literally. They had been transported intact from a demolished monastery, brought here as a donation in the 1930s. There, tucked between two philosophy volumes, she found a journal. Leather-bound, no title, just a symbol. The number 17 inside a spiral. She opened it. Entry 1. This is where sound remembers. The journal was filled with notes on resonance, broadcast theory, and dreams. But more than that. It read like a diary. Someone had lived with the booth before. Someone had become part of it. The final entry. I've gone into the signal. If they come, tell them to tune not to a station, but to a feeling. It's always 17 somewhere. It was signed, M.E.R., Margaret Ellen Raines, Leah's grandmother. They never knew she had written anything. They'd always thought she was just the voice. Leah held the journal like a relic. She knew, she whispered. All of it. The booth, the gate, the host. Clara leaned in. Do you think she was the first? Leah shook her head. Number. But I think she was the first to go willingly. In the following days, more people arrived. No announcement, no flyers, just intuition. They came with artifacts, photos that developed blank, unless left in the booth. Keys that didn't fit any door, except for one small drawer in the archive that hadn't opened in decades. Inside the drawer, a map of the radio waves in 1968, annotated by hand with circles and symbols. Each mark corresponded to a ghost station, places on the dial where static gave way, just briefly, to melody or voice. In the center, R17. Clara and Leah sat cross-legged on the floor of the gate, the map spread between them. It's a constellation, Clara said. Not of stars, of listeners. Leah nodded. We're inside the signal, not just recording it. They decided to play the RH-17 reel. As the tape spun, a low hum filled the room, not mechanical, but vocal. The voice of a man, modulated, speaking backwards. Clara flipped the audio. The words resolved into something familiar. This is Radio Hour 17. The hour between retreat and return. You are not late. You are precisely when you were meant to be. Leah wept. The voice was the host, but younger, unburdened. He spoke of a tower that sang, of a woman who read frequencies like poetry, of a place beyond time where stories waited for the right receiver. And then, the voice changed. It became Leah's, but not a recording. Her current voice, describing this moment, right now, sitting in the booth, listening to a tape she hadn't yet recorded. Clara stopped the reel. This is future audio. Leah nodded, wide-eyed. I haven't said those words yet, but you will. And when I do, you'll complete the loop. They kept the reel, didn't finish it. It was an anchor now, a reminder that the broadcast was no longer linear. They began calling the process looping. Every loop was a layering, one signal returning to where it began, but altered, more precise, more resonant. One evening, Leah began a broadcast not with the usual intro, but with a laugh. I'm not sure who's listening tonight. I might be talking to myself. I might be speaking into the future. But either way, this story isn't new. It's just ready. She told a tale of a sailor who navigated by absence, steering away from stars he had never seen, but somehow remembered. It ended with a single line. To be lost is only to be pre-remembered. The next morning, a letter arrived, postmarked from 1971, addressed to Leah. Inside, a page torn from her own notebook containing a story she hadn't written yet. The ink was her handwriting. The pen? Still on her desk. The envelope? Yellowed, worn, real. The message? You finished this on your 17th recording. Keep going. Clara looked at Leah. Do you remember writing that? Leah smiled faintly. Not yet. They added the letter to the archive. A new section had formed. Artifacts from Echo. It was growing rapidly. That week, a child wandered into the library. He was maybe 7. No parent. No name. Just holding a small transistor radio. He walked directly to the booth. Is this the place that talks back? Leah knelt. Why do you think that? The boy shrugged. I heard it. In the walls. Said, come find me. Clara exchanged a look with Leah. They let the boy step inside. The gate hummed. The radio on his belt switched on by itself, tuning to static. Then, a lullaby. One that Leah's grandmother used to hum. The boy closed his eyes. I remember now. He left without another word. By now, Leah no longer wrote scripts. She simply listened, then spoke. And every time, the signal grew clearer. Not louder, just more real. Clara swore she could see the broadcast now. Threads of light extending from the microphone, weaving through the shelves, out through the antenna they'd long forgotten existed atop the library's dome. One night, Leah said, mid-broadcast, if you're hearing this, then it's already begun. You're part of it. The story, the remembering, the return. They didn't understand it fully, but they didn't need to. The booth had become something more. Not an artifact, a gate. And the gate was open. The winter deepened around the library. Snow fell in sheets, not with violence, but with intention, blanketing the roof like pages being laid one atop another. Clara began to think of weather as chapters. A foggy morning, Prologue. A thunderstorm. Climax. The snow, perhaps, was the long, meditative epilogue. Inside, things were changing too. The booth no longer required activation. It breathed and blinked on its own. When Leah stepped inside, she didn't press any buttons. She simply closed the door and waited for the words to arrive. She was no longer just reading stories. She was remembering them forward. The broadcasts had taken on a new texture. They were not live. They were present. Timeless. The kind of voice one hears in a childhood dream, only to realize decades later it belonged to themselves. Clara continued archiving. Her stacks grew into nests. Bundles of ephemera, audio, and symbols that defied cataloging. There were letters in languages they didn't speak. Photographs with reversed shadows. A mirror that only reflected the room when the booth was broadcasting. Each night, Clara listened from the reading room. And each night, she felt less like a listener and more like a participant. She wasn't hearing about the hour 17 signal anymore. She was inside it. One evening, Leah emerged from the booth looking pale, not frightened but stretched, as though her body had been borrowed for something vast. "I heard my own death," she said matter-of-factly. Clara stood. "What?" Leah nodded. Not in a scary way, just... it was there. Not a moment. Not an event. A tone. A harmonic I'll return to. "You don't have to." "No," Leah said gently. "I want to. That's what this is. The booth isn't a machine. It's a memory organ. It's letting us hear our own shape across time." Clara sat beside her. "Do you think we're meant to keep going?" "I think we're meant to remember." The tape reels now labeled themselves. Not with writing, with feeling. One said, longing. Another, unspoken. A third, childhood left in a box beneath the stairs. They began sorting them not by content, but by resonance. Which ones felt like a Tuesday at dusk? Which ones sounded like your mother calling you in for dinner from 3 rooms away? Which ones reminded you of a question you almost asked someone you loved, but didn't? The archive grew soft. Not weak. Soft like well-worn fabric. Familiar. Comforting. One day, Clara found a reel she didn't remember recording. It was labeled, "This is where you begin again." She played it. It was her own voice, reading a letter she hadn't yet written. To Leah. About a day that hadn't come. "You're gone now," the voice said. "And I'm still here. But I'm not alone. Because you left the booth breathing, and the signal pulsing. You told me once that every goodbye is just a signal sent out, waiting for a reply." Clara stopped the tape. Leah came into the room. She'd heard. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Clara said, "Not yet." Leah nodded. "Not yet." Later, Leah spoke to the signal, not aloud, in her sleep. She began dreaming in frequencies, waking with numbers and tones on her tongue. Clara started transcribing them. They formed patterns, musical, yes, but also geographic. The numbers corresponded to latitudes, locations. They marked them on the library's globe. Each point, a transmitter site, long since dismantled, or so they thought. One night, they received a broadcast, not from themselves, not from their archive, but from one of those coordinates. The signal bled in through every speaker in the building, even the old intercom in the stairwell that had never worked. It was a voice, low, resonant, worn with dust. "This is not your echo. This is your origin. You are listening to the first frequency." Then, silence. Then, Leah's grandmother. Alive. Present. Speaking from somewhere beyond the booth. "You've heard the host, but you haven't met them. Not truly. They're not a person. They're a pattern. A welcoming. You were never broadcasting into nothing. You were answering a call. The voice faded, and the lights in the library flickered not with electricity, but with recognition. Clara whispered, "The host isn't one of us. It's all of us. Anyone who's ever tried to speak to something they couldn't see." They reopened the sealed level of the library, the basement, flooded decades ago, forgotten. The stairs creaked like violins played too slow. The air was dense with paper, rot, and memory. Down there they found another booth, older, identical, but made of stone and wire. Inside, a single candle, unburnt. A note beside it. Light when ready to transmit. They lit it and heard a heartbeat. Not biological, a metronome, a beat, a count-in. Then, a sound neither had ever heard but instantly recognized. Their own voices, merged. Reading not a script, but a dream they hadn't dreamt yet. The archive is the memory of the broadcast. The booth is the mouth. The listener is the key. The candle went out, but the booth stayed warm. They stopped questioning, stopped testing, and began trusting. Every broadcast was now a collaboration. Between present and past, listener and host, longing and reply. Listeners began writing in. Not emails, not texts. Letters. Handwritten. Sent without stamps. Still arriving. One said, "I dreamed of your voice before I ever heard it. Thank you for giving me context." Another, "I've been waiting 41 years to know I'm not alone. I never turned off my radio. I think you're the reply." A third, "I don't know who I am, but I remember your signal. That's enough." Leah read them on air. Clara archived each with a pressed violet from the field beside the library. They didn't plant violets there. They simply started growing. The host began appearing. Not as a person, but in dreams, in thoughts, in music that hummed through the pipes. Once, Clara looked at the gate and saw a shadow. A tall figure, made of signal noise and snowfall. It nodded once, then dissolved into light. Leah whispered, "That's them." They didn't fear it. They felt relieved. On the 17th day of the 17th broadcast cycle, Leah opened a tape marked only with a fingerprint, pressed in wax. Inside, a melody. Just 5 notes. She played them. The booth resonated, not externally, but through them. Their bones vibrated. Their teeth buzzed. And then, they remembered. The first time they ever heard a story. The first lullaby. The first time they understood that a voice could be a place. And in that moment, they weren't in a library. They were in the archive itself. The big one. The true one. The one that exists outside time. Every story. Every signal. Every whisper that had ever traveled through airwaves and mind waves and dream waves. Leah spoke. "This is Radio Hour 17. You are listening not with ears, but with longing. We are your voice returned to you. We are your proof." And then she vanished. Not in horror, not in tragedy, in completion. She had looped. Clara did not weep. She simply stepped into the booth, closed her eyes, and waited. The signal came at once. Leah's voice, in echo. "It's always 17 somewhere. When I left the broadcast library that night, I couldn't shake the strange weight of what I'd heard. The whispering, the unnatural gaps in audio, the rhythm of scenes that bent around something invisible. They'd done more than hint at mystery. They'd behaved like symptoms of something still alive. Something unfinished. The city was unusually quiet. The trolley wires didn't hum, and the neon lights of the diners and bars cast a muted glow against rain-slicked sidewalks. It felt, somehow, as if the world itself had dimmed its brightness out of respect for what had been uncovered. I walked with the heavy feeling that I was part of something I couldn't see the edges of. Something the people who created Radio Hour 17 had known and never fully revealed. Back in my apartment, I re-listened to the whole broadcast. Not just once, but twice. I took notes, mapped timings, logged anomalies. And that's when I noticed something odd about the background noise in the middle third of the show, specifically the scene at the train station. What at first sounded like just ambient platform chatter and mechanical ambience resolved when isolated into rhythmic beats, patterns, repetitions, the sound of something coded. I ran the segment through a spectral analysis, a waveform mapping technique used in restoration work, usually reserved for separating hiss from voice. What it revealed shocked me. Morse code. Extremely faint. Almost certainly unintended. Or perhaps meant to be barely perceptible. And the sequence repeated every 37 seconds for 4 minutes and 22 seconds before it abruptly ceased. Translated, it said, "Transmission held. Proceed with caution. Eyes on the gate." I sat back from my screen. That's when I realized that the term transmission appeared only once in the actual script of Radio Hour 17. And it was in the mouth of a minor character who said something otherwise forgettable. Something about delays in the last transmission. But with this code layered beneath it, the word took on new significance. The deeper I looked, the more it unraveled. Marion had said once that the writers had embedded Easter eggs. Yes. But this wasn't that. This wasn't clever references to contemporary events or name drops of rival programs. This was an entirely different kind of embedding. This was infrastructure, messaging below the surface. By the end of the week, I had documented 7 distinct irregularities in the sound design of the show. Most people would have called them production errors. A reel cue that doesn't quite match the dialogue. A room tone that shifts in impossible ways. Footsteps that continue too long or disappear too early. But when aligned, when tracked precisely against timecode, they formed a shape. Literally. A geometric sequence. The inconsistencies, when mapped across a diagram of the sound reel's time progression, traced a spiral pattern. I verified it 3 times. It wasn't random. It was intentional. And I wasn't alone in discovering it. A forum post, 7 years old, on an obsolete message board dedicated to lost radio ephemera, had noted a strange, recurring spatial fade in the middle acts of Radio Hour 17. No one had replied to the post. No one had taken it seriously. The user who wrote it never posted again. But they signed off with a phrase: "We never broadcast alone." I reached out to the restoration team once more. I asked for access to the mastering logs. Anything that might show tampering or post-processing outside normal workflow. They were reluctant at first, but the team lead, a man named Sergio, finally relented. We met in a back office late one night. He looked tired and wary. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he said. He opened a drawer and pulled out a weathered composition notebook. Inside were printouts, pencil diagrams, engineering scribbles. It wasn't part of any official restoration record. It was his own research. I kept these notes after the first listen. Didn't tell the team. Too weird. What he'd found confirmed my worst suspicion. There were inconsistencies, not just in the audio, but in the tape reels themselves. Slight variations in magnetic density. Echo layers that didn't match the room tone of the studio. Faint prints of what sounded like reverse playback, as if someone had recorded over the original with a second, hidden message, and then erased it just enough to avoid detection by analog tools. But when we digitized the reels, he said, some of it bled through. I asked him if he'd ever tried isolating the bleed. He looked at me sharply. "No," he said, and I wouldn't. Why not? Because whatever's under there, it wasn't meant for playback. We stared at each other in silence, and it struck me how far we'd come from a simple, historical curiosity. This wasn't just a lost episode of old-time radio. This was something else. Something that had been built, broadcast, and then buried. Not just to silence it, but to keep it from being heard again. After Sergio left, I stayed in the office. I made a copy of the files. And that night, back at my apartment, I did what he hadn't. I isolated the bleed. I ran the waveform in reverse. It didn't reveal a message in words. It revealed sound, a tone, low and rhythmic, not unlike an EKG heartbeat slowed to an impossible pace. Beneath that, almost in another frequency range, were textures that resembled human breath. Not spoken, not gasped, just present. As if someone were there, inside the signal, listening. Back. I left the room, paced the hallway. When I returned, the playback had stopped. The file had closed, and my computer, brand new, up to date, never problematic, had powered itself down. I stared at the blank screen for a long time, and in the silence, I thought again of the line from that forum post. We never broadcast alone. The next morning, I found myself standing once again outside the doors of WKNZ's basement archive. I hadn't planned on returning. I had no appointment, no clearance, no invitation. But something about the reversed tone I'd heard, something in the shape of its silence, drew me back. It felt unfinished. I knocked, waited, and was let in by a new intern who barely glanced at my credentials. She must have assumed I belonged. Or maybe the building itself had decided I did. Either way, I found myself descending the narrow stairwell into the familiar hum of the archive vaults. The walls seemed closer than before. The air, somehow heavier. The master reels of Radio Hour 17 were gone. I asked the archivist on duty, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a librarian's gait, where they'd been moved. She stared at me for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Back in the vault," she said, "where they've always been." I asked to see them. She frowned, checked the ledger. "Strange," she murmured. "It says here they were refiled in the East Wing, but we don't have an East Wing." She laughed softly. "Must be a clerical error, or an old note from before the renovations." I knew better. The East Wing had never existed in the plans I'd seen. I excused myself and wandered the lower level until I found a corridor sealed off by a rolling cage. It wasn't locked, just chained loosely, as if meant to suggest restriction without enforcing it. I slipped through. The hallway was longer than I remembered, and colder. At the far end, a door stood ajar. Its hinges creaked like an unspoken warning. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was not an archive room. It was a studio. Not a modern studio. This one was vintage, preserved in perfect stasis. The walls were lined with dark acoustic panels, the corners rounded with the softness of mid-century design. A red-on air bulb hung above the door, dark and dusty. In the center, a microphone stood alone beneath a suspended lamp. The light was faint, but focused, like a spotlight in a forgotten theater. No one had broadcast from this room in decades. And yet, the equipment was warm. I stepped to the console. The switches were labeled not with numbers, but with symbols, triangles, spirals, stars. The real machine was threaded, and the tape was spinning. I hadn't pressed anything. A voice began to speak. Not through the speakers, through the room itself. It was soft, distant, familiar. The same voice I'd heard beneath the signal. The breath between tones. It didn't introduce itself. It didn't speak a name. But it told a story. Not of Radio Hour 17, but of something older. A tradition passed between operators. Voices trained not only to read scripts, but to send messages in frequencies only certain ears could hear. The broadcasters, the voice said, were once keepers. Not of content, but of passage. Passage? I whispered aloud. To memory, the voice replied. The light above the mic flickered. There are stories that can't be told directly. Stories that change when spoken. But the voice, the shape of the voice, carries a residue, a design. Some broadcasts were never meant to be remembered as words. They were meant to imprint. A second reel began to spin. The console came alive. Dials rose. Levels balanced. The room filled with a low hum, the kind that vibrates your teeth. Not unpleasant, but felt more than heard. And then I understood. Radio Hour 17 had not simply gone missing. It had been shelved. Too powerful to delete. Too important to lose. But too strange. Too unexplainable to allow in daylight. It was a vessel. And now, it was speaking again. I stayed in that room for what felt like hours. Not listening, exactly. Receiving. The signal wasn't information. It was atmosphere, emotion. A slow unfolding of impressions. A child waiting by a radio. A woman reading a letter never sent. A train that never arrived. Places and people that didn't exist in any timeline, but that I remembered as if I'd lived them. I wept. And then, the reels stopped. Silence returned. The light went out, and the door behind me creaked open on its own. I stepped into the hallway, but it was no longer the corridor I'd come through. This one was narrower, lit by pale bulbs that buzzed with age. The walls were lined with photographs, some of them recognizable as WKNZ staff from the 1940s, others unmarked, their faces blurred or shadowed. At the very end of the hallway was a single photograph in a brass frame. It was a group portrait, the cast of Radio Hour 17. But, in the center, where the director should have stood, was only a microphone and a caption. We never broadcast alone. I don't remember leaving the building. I woke up in my apartment the next morning, fully clothed, my voice recorder still in my hand. On it, a single file. I played it. Silence. Then, faintly, you heard us. Now remember. Since then, I've returned to WKNZ many times. The hallway is gone. The archivist no longer remembers me. Sergio transferred to a different station, without notice. The old studio, if it ever existed, is sealed behind drywall and code violations. But I know what I heard. I know what I remember. And when I tune my radio at night between frequencies, between the static, I sometimes hear a tone, a breath, a flicker of dialogue that doesn't belong to any program. I keep listening, because if there's one thing Radio Hour 17 taught me, it's that stories never truly disappear. They wait, in silence, in static, in spirals. And when the time is right, they speak again. This is Midnight Broadcast, and you've been listening to the Storylight Chronicle, the lost voice of radio. Hour 17. The static fades, but the story stays with you. I'm Miles, and this has been your hour on Midnight Broadcast. Wherever you go from here, take the stillness with you.